They said that in the winter of 1886, the cold in Willowbend fell like a silent weight on the houses, freezing not only the earth, but also what people did not have the courage to admit aloud. Before continuing, the narrator leaves a sentence almost whispered in the air. Discreet, lost in the documentary tone. If you're listening, comment on which city you're watching from, and what time it is there now. And then the story continues, without breaking the mood, as if that sentence were just another marginal note in a research notebook. Willowbend was a small village, nestled between dense hills and narrow streams in the Missouri countryside, inhabited by families who depended on horses, wood, and long journeys to survive. The wind blew through the cracks in the cabins as if carrying memories from decades past, and the residents used to say that in those lands, each winter left different marks on people, some deeper than the snow allowed them to see. Among the oldest surnames in the region were the Willowbend sisters, Eunice and Marjorie, two women of strong presence, known both for their skill with horses and for their responsibility for keeping alive the small inn inherited from their father, a veteran of 1863 who had never gotten over the battlefield. They grew up feeding animals before dawn, cleaning harnesses with hardened hands, and listening to stories about travelers who crossed those hills in search of work, shelter, or just silence. Accounts from that time describe the sisters with almost photographic precision. Eunice, the eldest, was quiet and calculating, with a gaze that seemed to analyze every detail before she spoke. Marjorie, on the other hand, had a lighter smile, but carried on her shoulders the same rigidity that life in the countryside demanded. Both were respected, and at the same time observed from a distance, as if they carried within them a kind of strength that not everyone understood. The inn they ran was on the edge of the village, near the valley that turned into a corridor of biting wind during the winter. There was a makeshift underground room there built by their father, a cold storage room where they kept salted meat, extra coats, and, according to some travelers, even harnesses for unknown horses. In the official archives, this space is mentioned only once in an 1881 inventory under the curious name of Frost Chamber. No one knows if their father actually coined the term or if a local clerk decided to record the word that way out of irony, but the name stuck. Life in Willowbend before that winter was stable, albeit harsh. The residents trusted the sisters. They knew that the horses left in their care would return stronger, that travelers would receive a warm bed, and that when necessary, Eunice and Marjorie would help search for people lost in the woods, a constant risk in that region. The sisters' reputation was solid enough to span generations. However, when leafing through the recently restored records, stained letters, fragmented testimonies, notes from replaced sheriffs, there is one detail that repeats itself with disturbing frequency. Every time someone disappeared in the hills, the last safe place they had been seen was the Willowbend Inn. The researcher responsible for the modern compilation of these documents draws attention to an almost imperceptible point. In the weeks leading up to the 1886 event, when 33 horsemen disappeared along a single stretch of the hills, reports about the sisters become strangely vague. The dates don't match, witnesses confuse times, and some names that should appear on guest lists are nowhere to be found. It is as if, shortly before the tragedy, a subtle veil had been placed over the inn's routine. Nothing explicit, nothing supernatural, just gaps. And in history, gaps speak volumes. In the state archives, there is also a note made by a sheriff's deputy, written in quick, almost angry handwriting. If you want to understand where to start, look again at the Frost Chamber. That storage room was never just a storage room. This is the point where the modern investigation begins to fold in on itself. Nothing is clear, nothing is definitive, and yet everything converges on the Willowbend sisters, their harshest winter, and the mysterious frozen room that would later become a silent symbol of that case. The block ends with the researcher running his finger along the margins of an aged document. There is one last line, written by someone whose name has been lost. The riders were there that week, but no one knows who opened the door for them. Before the week in which 33 riders disappeared, Willowbend followed its usual rhythm. marked by slow working days and short nights, broken only by the crackling of wood burning in iron stoves. Those who observe the village through the eyes of the records of the time find a community that was held together not by affection, but by necessity. The distance between the houses, the constant cold, and the precariousness of the roads forced everyone into a silent pact of mutual survival. The Willowbend sisters lived on the edge of this small world. The inn, with its darkened wooden facade and windows always partially closed, served as a link between the village and the outsiders who crossed the hills. It was common to hear, in the mornings, the rhythmic trot of horses arriving from the east, their horseshoes marking the frozen ground, and Marjorie leaving the kitchen in her thick apron to welcome travelers with strong coffee and measured questions. Eunice used to watch from the door, without smiling, but always attentive to the condition of the animals. Documents written by travelers reveal intimate details of the routine: the constant smell of wet leather, the muffled sound of boots drying near the stove, and whispered conversations about dangerous routes, winter ambushes, and trails blocked by landslides. For many, the inn was the only safe haven before continuing their journey to the lumber mills in the north or the small trading towns near the river. The sisters knew every trail, every detour. They knew when a storm was about to cross the valley just by observing the behavior of the horses, something that residents still remember today with a mixture of respect and amazement. Some reported that Eunice could tell, down to the hour, when a group of travelers would arrive, even without prior notice. It was just experience, they said. Others, however, believed that she observed things that no one else noticed: slight variations in the wind, recent hoofprints, distant noises escaping from the valley. In notes preserved in the collection of a local merchant, there is a curious record dated a few weeks before the disappearance. It describes how, during that season, demand for the Sisters' Inn had increased more than usual. Larger groups, made up of independent horsemen, began to pass through Willowbend with unusual frequency. The local economy grew rapidly. More orders for horseshoes, more bales of hay sold, more horses needing care. For the village, it was a sign of prosperity. For the sisters, it meant twice as much work. What the residents would only realize later was that these groups had something in common. They traveled in a hurry, spoke little, and seemed to avoid explaining their routes. Some carried makeshift hand-drawn maps and refused the sisters' help in planning safer routes. A note from the sheriff, found years later, mentions that the men arrived exhausted, but left as if they had an urgent destination that could not bear delay. No one questioned them. No one insisted. Willowbend was a village that respected the silence of others. Inside the inn, the sisters' routine remained meticulous. Eunice took care of the stable at dawn, checking on the animals' health, cleaning the corridors, and organizing harnesses. Marjorie, despite her slight smile, carried a weariness in her eyes that only a few noticed. In statements recorded decades later, a neighbor commented that she had never seen Marjorie so distracted, as if something was weighing on her mind, something she avoided saying. It is unclear what might have been troubling her. The records are fragmented, but it is a fact that during that season, an almost invisible tension hung between the sisters. Witnesses report minor disagreements, quick exchanges of glances, long pauses in conversations. Nothing overtly serious, just subtleties noticeable only to those who had known the two since childhood. When cross-referencing these testimonies with documents from the period, modern researchers notice a disturbing pattern. Nights, when metallic noises came from the inn's basement, from the frost chamber. Neighbors attributed the sounds to the simple storage of tools, but an old note mentions the presence of light coming from cracks in the floor, as if someone were working down there long after the inn closed its doors. Still, none of this seemed serious enough to arouse suspicion at the time. The town was absorbed in its own concerns. The harshest winter in recent years, rapidly spreading diseases, and a shortage of supplies. And amid all this, travelers continued to arrive. It was during this period that the horsemen who would later disappear passed through Willowbend for the first time. They were men from the east, exhausted and silent. The only consistent description in the archives is that their horses were exceptionally worn out, as if they had traveled long distances without adequate rest. Marjorie welcomed them with her usual hospitality, but Eunice, according to one account, stood for long minutes just watching the hoofprints in the snow, prints deeper than expected for such tired animals. No one knows what she concluded at that moment. The diary she kept during her youth records only a brief entry from that period. There are things coming to Willowbend that shouldn't be coming here. From there, the accounts begin to fragment. One traveler says he heard the riders arguing in low voices at dawn. Another claims to have seen one of them descending toward the underground storage room accompanied by Eunice. A third says he woke up to the sound of horses being led out of the inn long before dawn. None of this has been officially confirmed, but it all appears repeatedly in scattered form in the surviving archives. And amid this seemingly ordinary routine, filled with small anomalies, a silent fact emerges. The growing movement of horsemen and the discreet tension between the sisters coincide exactly with the days leading up to the collective disappearance. In the merchant's records, there is one last note before the men's disappearance. If more travelers keep coming, the sisters won't have room for everyone. There's something strange about these groups. I can't say what it is, but there's something. This is the last entry before the mood in Willowbend begins to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if winter were announcing that something bigger was coming. The block ends with a reconstructed image of Marjorie at the inn door, watching the horsemen prepare to leave, while Eunice remains behind her, motionless, gazing at the frozen horizon. A detail captured in countless oral accounts, but never explained in official documents. What followed in the days before the disappearance of the 33 horsemen is reconstructed today based on fragments, incomplete testimonies, discontinuous notes from authorities, and above all, surviving memories from a time when no one imagined that those details would become pieces of a century-old mystery. The horsemen arrived at Willowbend for the second time in the early hours of a pale afternoon, when the sun seemed more like a faded glow than a real source of heat. Their cloaks were covered with ice, and their horses were restless. There was urgency in their movements, but not the nervous urgency of those who fear pursuit. It was a silent haste, like that of men accustomed to carrying responsibilities that could not be put into words. Eunice was the first to notice them approaching. She was holding a bucket of frozen water when she heard the muffled sound of hooves, an irregular, almost tremulous rhythm. Marjorie came out shortly after, drying her hands on her apron, and both watched the group form in front of the inn with the same uneasy feeling described in later accounts, as if each new return of those men pulled the village a few inches closer to a problem that no one understood. The riders did not ask for full meals, only hot water, hay, and a few minutes inside the inn to warm up. They spoke little, exchanged quick glances, and every now and then one of them would write something on pieces of paper that he immediately tucked into his coat. At one point, a resident claimed to have seen Eunice receive one of these papers from the hands of the oldest knight, a man with a thick beard and a hardened gaze, but no one could confirm the content of the message. The document was never found. The following hours became crucial. The wind picked up, bringing with it a fine mist that covered the village like a cotton cloth. The air was so still that even the sounds seemed muffled. This is where the accounts diverge and are therefore even more valuable to the modern researcher. A traveler staying at the inn said he saw light coming from cracks in the floor of the main room, radiating from the frost chamber. Another witness, a young woman who worked for a local merchant, reported hearing firm footsteps coming down the stairs from the storeroom. Footsteps that, according to her, were those of someone moving with familiarity, not a lost guest. And there is also the account of a man who claimed to have seen two horsemen, accompanied by Eunice, leaving through the back door and walking toward the old wooden shed a few yards from the inn. None of these testimonies were considered conclusive by the authorities at the time, but when placed side by side, they form a pattern. Something was happening that afternoon between the sisters and the horsemen, away from the eyes of the community. As night fell, the fog thickened. A thick layer of cold settled on the porch boards, and the inn's porch began to creak under the weight of the ice. The village was silent. People had gathered their animals, closed their windows, and extinguished their lamps. Only the inn remained unusually busy, shadows crossing the doorway, horses being rearranged, muffled voices escaping through the cracks. Records preserved by the sheriff of that decade describe that around 9:30 p.m., the horsemen began to gather outside, preparing their horses for departure. It was not normal for travelers to leave Willowbend so late in the middle of winter. The road to the next settlement was long, winding, treacherous, and that week completely covered in ice. But they seemed determined, as if something were forcing them to leave before dawn. It was at this moment that Marjorie approached Eunice, saying something in a low voice, recorded only by a witness who could not hear the exact words. What she did pick up, however, was the expression on both their faces. Deep concern, almost silent mourning, as if they both knew that something was about to break. The last confirmed reports before the disappearance described the same scene from different angles. Horsemen mounting their horses with heavy movements, as if carrying more numbers than weight. Eunice holding the lantern in front of the inn, partially illuminating the tense faces of the group. Marjorie standing a few steps behind, her hands clasped, her fingers pressed so tightly together that they left visible marks on her skin. The biting wind pushing the riders' cloaks aside, revealing for a moment folded maps and small leather packages that no resident could identify. Around 10:15, according to the record of a farmer who had passed through the village shortly before retiring, the group of 33 men finally left. The fog was so thick that the end of the main street was barely visible. The horseshoes hit the wooden floor with a muffled sound, as if there were snow between the metal and the ground. And then one last element, one that would be repeated in all accounts and passed down through generations, happened. The horsemen did not follow the main trail. Instead, they turned onto the narrow path that skirts the North Hill, a route avoided by most residents during the winter. This detour, recorded by both witnesses and hoof marks found 2 days later, would become the official starting point of the investigation. In reconstructing that night, the researcher highlights a detail overlooked by the authorities at the time. The North Trail led nowhere that winter. It was blocked by landslides and a layer of ice so thick that even experienced riders would not risk crossing it. Why then would 33 men take that route? The answer was never found, but there are disturbing clues preserved among the papers. A crumpled note found inside the youngest rider's coat contained only 4 words, written in haste. "Don't stop for anything." Another document mentions that Eunice remained in front of the inn for several minutes after their departure, holding the lantern even after the flame began to flicker in the wind. She only went inside when the last silhouette had completely disappeared into the fog. No one at the time noticed, but that specific moment would be cited in several later testimonies as the exact moment when something changed in the sisters' countenance, as if both somehow knew that that night would mark a turning point in the village's history. 2 hours later, according to weather records, the fog turned into a blizzard. The northern trail was completely covered, and from then on, no trace of the riders was found for an entire week. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks, no remains of a camp, only silence. A silence so deep that when the residents began to search, they seemed to be walking through a place that erased their own footsteps. The last confirmed evidence comes 3 days after the disappearance, when a group of men find, at a remote point on the trail, a single object, a piece of leather hardened by ice, probably part of one of the bundles the horsemen were carrying. Inside it, only a small strip of torn paper, without words, as if it had been hastily torn from something larger. It is with this last image that the researcher concludes his reconstruction of the night. 33 horsemen advancing into the fog, veering off onto a path that made no sense, taking with them secrets that may never have been meant for the village, and leaving behind only silence and a blank sheet of paper. The news of the riders' disappearance took a few days to reach Willowbend. The first to realize the gravity of the situation were the residents themselves who, upon climbing the North Trail in search of firewood and lost animals, found only churned snow and the incomplete trail of horseshoes, marks that ended abruptly on a frozen stretch, as if the ground had swallowed the rest of the path. The sheriff at the time, Luther Callahan, was a strict man, accustomed to dealing with minor conflicts, fights between neighbors, occasional thefts, boundary disputes. He had never led a search in such a hostile environment. His first report, preserved in a folder with burnt edges, begins with almost military precision. 33 men left the Willowbend Sisters Inn. None returned. The community reacted in a divided manner. Some believed the riders had fallen into a natural trap, a crevasse hidden under the snow, a sudden avalanche, ice that was more fragile than it appeared. Others, however, spoke of voluntary abandonment, a hypothesis difficult to sustain. It would make no sense for exhausted men, traveling for weeks, to deliberately choose to disappear on a frozen route. The Willowbend sisters were the first to be questioned. Contemporary accounts describe Eunice's demeanor as firm, almost defiant. She recounted the rider's departure in short, direct sentences, without speculation. Marjorie, according to one witness, trembled slightly as she answered questions, a tremor she attributed to the cold, but which neighbors would remember for decades. The sheriff carefully recorded everything, noting pauses, hesitations, and indirect details. In his personal notes not included in the official report, there is a revealing comment. They know more than they are saying, not out of malice but out of fear of something greater than themselves. Still, no concrete evidence pointed to the sisters' involvement. The frost chamber was inspected 4 times. They found only tools, supplies, and a few wooden boxes tied with thick ropes, all containing common items such as salt, rustic fabrics, or old harnesses. Nothing that could link the room to the disappearance of the riders. The investigation then moved on to the valley. Residents and volunteers searched the northern trail for days, following every irregularity in the frozen ground, every shadow that could represent a trace. But the snow, always the snow, insisted on erasing everything. At the end of the first week, there was not a single concrete sign of the passage of the 33 men. It was at that moment that the first rumor arose. A farmer, known for being observant, claimed to have seen Eunice leave the inn in the middle of the night, 2 days before the official start of the search. She had walked to the edge of the valley, stopped for a few moments, and returned without being seen by anyone else. He insisted that she seemed to be looking for something, or someone. The sheriff recorded the statement but was unable to confirm its veracity. Eunice denied it, and several residents reinforced that it would be unlikely for her to go out alone in such extreme cold. Still, the rumor spread through the houses, increasing the silent suspicion that hung over the sisters. Another ambiguous clue emerged when a group of searchers found a piece of dark fabric, similar to the material used in riders' capes, stuck to a dry branch. The fabric was torn irregularly, as if it had been ripped off by force. However, its location, too far from the route taken by the group, weakened the relevance of that evidence. Still, the sheriff included the finding in his report, noting, "Nothing is definitive, but everything matters." As the days passed, tension in Willowbend increased. Some residents demanded that the sisters be taken to the neighboring town for formal questioning. Others, on the contrary, insisted that they were only witnesses, not suspects. The debate never turned into an open fight, but it was possible to feel, at community meetings, the division that discreetly tore at the social fabric of the village. Meanwhile, Marjorie began to distance herself from people. Working less in the kitchen, she often retreated to the second floor of the inn, where narrow windows overlooked the North Hill. Neighbors report seeing her motionless silhouette there, staring at the frozen horizon for minutes on end. Eunice, on the other hand, intensified her routine in the stable. There are entries in the archives that mention her meticulous behavior during those days. She cleaned harnesses that had not been used, reorganized tools almost obsessively, and avoided long conversations. It was as if her every gesture was an attempt to maintain order in a world that was beginning to fall apart. It was only on the 10th day after the disappearance that something unexpected occurred. One of the volunteers found a small metal object partially buried in the snow. A belt buckle marked with a simple symbol, 2 parallel lines crossed by a third. Modern researchers identify this symbol in documents from other regions, always associated with groups of independent travelers, usually merchants or messengers who operated without official affiliation. The buckle rekindled hope, albeit briefly. However, no other similar items were found. It was a solitary, isolated trace, insufficient to construct a solid narrative. In compiling the documents, the researcher notes that this moment, the discovery of the buckle, marks an important emotional turning point in the case. The community, which until then had been divided between suspicion and concern, slowly began to accept a painful possibility that the riders would never be found. The Willowbend sisters, however, reacted differently. Marjorie reportedly cried upon hearing of the discovery, not out of hope, but for something no one could identify, a kind of sad relief perhaps. Eunice, on the other hand, remained impassive, saying only that the symbol was unfamiliar to her. But there is a document, hidden among papers attached decades later, that sheds new light on this point. It is an anonymous note, sent to the sheriff many years after the case, containing only one sentence. She recognized the symbol, but couldn't admit it. The researcher found no evidence to support this claim. However, when interviewing descendants of residents from that time, one narrative is repeated insistently. The idea that Eunice knew more than she revealed, not about the fate of the riders, but about the reason that brought them back that particular week. With winter advancing and resources running low, the search was officially called off after 15 days. The final report, signed by Sheriff Callahan, concludes that the disappearance was due to extreme and unknown conditions that prevented any survival or return. The village gradually returned to normal, but the Willowbend sisters were never the same again. Marjorie became withdrawn, avoiding conversation, averting her gaze whenever the riders' names were mentioned. Eunice began to occupy herself with increasingly solitary tasks, as if the responsibility of keeping the inn running were a way to silence something inside her, a burden that only she understood. The final revelation in this section, subtle and painful, comes in a letter found only recently in the restored archives. A note written by Marjorie to a distant cousin, dated a few weeks after the search ended. In it, there is a sentence that, although it does not explain the disappearance, alters the perception of the sisters' relationship with the knights. They came back for us, but not for what the village thinks. No other details are offered. The letter ends abruptly, and there is no continuation. The block ends with this sentence hanging like a historical shadow, a fragment that does not solve the mystery, but reveals the most human of fears, that of carrying, even unintentionally, a bond with something that should never have returned. When the case of the Willowbend sisters first appears in a modern archive, it is no longer a recent event, but a sediment of memories deposited in multiple layers. There are different stamps, handwriting that changes over the decades, yellowed sheets that have been rearranged so many times that the edges seem to have lost track of where they began. The narrator historian comes into contact with this story, not in Willowbend, but in a cold state archive room decades later. The clock on the wall marks a time that no longer belongs to those involved. It belongs only to those who investigate. On the table, the folder with the name of the village rests like any other, until someone decides to open it, and in doing so, realizes that certain absences weigh more than much of the evidence. He begins with what is concrete. Sheriff Luther Callahan's report, the residents' statements, the weather record for that disproportionately severe winter, the note about the riders' detour along the Northern Trail. All of this forms a logical, albeit incomplete, mosaic. Tired men, hostile terrain, an inadequate route, intense snowfall. In purely practical terms, it is possible to imagine what happened: disorientation, falls, freezing, an error of judgment amplified by extreme circumstances. But as the historian progresses through the pages, he discovers that what keeps the case alive is not just the sum of natural factors. It is the weight of a phrase here, the silence of a name there, the persistence of a rumor that has survived longer than any document. What remains of the Willowbend sisters, for example, is not just physical descriptions or testimonies of their routine. It is the gaps surrounding the choices they made that week. Later documents indicate that a few years after their disappearance, the inn gradually lost business. Trade routes shifted, railroad lines brought other cities closer, and Willowbend became an almost forgotten spot on the map. The sisters remained there for some time, sustaining an increasingly empty business. Then they simply disappeared from local records. No death certificates have been found for either of them in the county. One of them, according to a marginal note made decades later by a distracted clerk, may have moved east, the other perhaps to the south. The sentence ends with a poorly drawn question mark, as if even the clerk had given up on finding a definitive answer. For the historian, these absences are not just bureaucratic failures. They are traces of a decision to move away from the place that would forever be associated with the night when 33 men left and never returned. Rereading Marjorie's letter to her distant cousin, the one in which she writes, "They came back for us, but not for what the village thinks." The researcher realizes that this is not a confession, but an acknowledgement of a bond. The horsemen were not just anonymous guests. There was a previous history, perhaps linked to the sisters' father, a war veteran, accustomed to risky routes, informal agreements, and discreet transportation. In other archives from neighboring counties, there are scattered references to groups of horsemen who acted as unofficial messengers, carrying documents, money, or sensitive information along trails away from the main routes. They operated in rural areas, had few safe points, and depended on specific inns where they knew they would find discretion. There is no confirmation that the men of Willowbend belong to this same circuit, but the clues speak to each other. The symbol on the buckle, the silent haste, the scribbled maps, the leather packages that were never identified. The historian, aware of the limits of his role, avoids stating what he cannot prove. Instead, he allows himself to formulate a deeply human hypothesis. Perhaps the sisters, or at least Eunice, knew that those men were carrying something that could not stop there. Not gold, not a fabulous treasure, but something simpler and yet decisive. Contracts, orders, lists of names perhaps. Something that, if retained, would put the entire village at risk of future retaliation. Something that presented them with a dilemma: protect the community or protect those who in some way had trusted them for years. Whatever the nature of that bond, the result was the same. The horsemen left that night of their own accord, but also because in some way they counted on the sisters' silence. Not necessarily a complicit silence, but a silence that carries the weight of understanding that certain decisions cannot be made in public. This interpretation, while plausible, does not explain the disappearance. It may explain why they returned, but not why they never arrived. The trail remains frozen. The snow continues to fall. The terrain remains inhospitable. Nature, in this case, needs no help to wipe 33 men off the map. Years later, the historian visits what remains of Willowbend. The village has been reduced to a few scattered structures, and the sisters' old inn is no longer there. Where the frost chamber once stood, there is only a slight depression in the ground, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. A dry branch, stuck in the ground by some former resident, marks the spot where the boards were torn out when the building was demolished. He remains there for a few minutes, letting the wind carry away the smallest sounds. He observes the surrounding hills, now covered not with snow, but with an uneven green that time has returned to the valley. It is difficult to reconcile this present with the descriptions of the winter of 1886, when the cold seemed like a concrete force, capable of shaping decisions and erasing footprints. Looking at that emptiness, the researcher understands something that doesn't fit in reports. The Willowbend sisters case was never just about 33 horsemen who disappeared. It was also about 2 women forced to occupy the uncomfortable space between what they knew, what they could say, and what they chose to keep to themselves. In his personal notebooks, the historian writes that every investigation, at some level, comes up against an ethical boundary. To what extent is it possible to judge choices made in contexts that no longer exist? It is easy, from a distance, to point out what should have been done. What is difficult is to remember that for those who lived there, night fell in a very concrete way, with real cold, real threats and uncertainties that could not be resolved with theories. He returns to the documents one last time. He recalls the image of Eunice holding the lamp as the horseman disappeared into the fog. He recalls Marjorie at the window, months later, looking at the North Hill as if she still expected an unlikely return. He recalls the crumpled note with the words, "Don't stop for anything," and the strip of blank paper found in the leather package. Perhaps the blank sheet is the most accurate metaphor for what remained of that winter. Not an answer, but a space where each generation that reads about the case projects its own explanations, its own fears, its own questions about what it would do in the place of those two women, faced with 33 men carrying something that could not be lost, but which, nevertheless, was lost. When he concludes his research, the historian does not write a definitive conclusion. Instead, he records a short, almost modest paragraph that could be read as an epitaph for all those involved. Between the snow that erased the riders' tracks and the silence that accompanied the sisters until the end of their lives, what remains is not a culprit, but a question. How many decisions were made that night in hushed tones that we will never know? And it is there, precisely at that point, where the account approaches the limit of what can be said, that the story of the Willowbend sisters ceases to be just an old case and becomes something broader. A reminder that some disappearances do not only happen on maps, but also in the space between a choice and the impossibility of explaining it. The video ends without an answer, without a final explanation, only with the imagined sound of a distant wind blowing through a valley that is no longer the same, and with the uncomfortable feeling that sometimes what scares us most is not what was never found, but what, perhaps, someone decided never to tell.